What is economics? At its root, economics is a way of analyzing decision-making under constraints. No decision is completely costless. We face scarcity. Our wants exceed the means available to satisfy those wants. Our time and energy are limited. In light of constraints and trade-offs, economics begins with the assumption that individuals make choices consistent with their desires and values. Generally, economics focuses on consumption, production, and exchange of goods within markets. That's why when you think of economics, you probably think about money and business. But the economic way of thinking is far more broadly applicable than to just markets. Economists have looked at a wide variety of non-market decision-making too. Gary Becker famously analyzed traditionally sociological areas such as crime, discrimination, and even relationships within the family using the economic way of thinking. Nobel laureate James Buchanan analyzed political decision-making. Larry Iannacone looked at religion. And Robert Eklund, Robert Tullison, and Robert Hebert analyzed Christian church history through the lens of economic theory of the firm. The point is that economics is not just about money and markets, though that certainly plays a key role. Economics is ultimately a way of analyzing the world and decision-making under constraints. So what does that mean? What is the economic method, or economic way of thinking, as Paul Hayne put it? In his 1995 essay, Economics is a Way of Thinking, Hayne writes that the economic approach has two distinct focuses: human action and human interactions. Actions are made by individuals who are seeking to do the best that they can given the constraints they face. That is, they economize. In a traditional market, sellers are assumed to economize, seeking to maximize profits by trying to find the lowest cost method to produce goods at desired prices greater than cost. And buyers are seeking to satisfy as much of their desires as they can, given their limited purchasing power. Economics does not assume that individuals are only selfish or desiring to maximize their money holdings. Rather, as Gary Becker writes, the analysis assumes that individuals maximize welfare as they conceive it, whether they be selfish, altruistic, loyal, spiteful, or masochistic. The preferences depend on individuals. Interactions arise when there are individuals with competing plans. You want to use some wood to build a house, but I want to use it to build a piano. There's a finite amount of wood. Likewise, there's a finite amount of resources available to us in general, but an infinite possibility of uses. The solution? Coordination. Property rights are one tool to give clear control over the use of resources, but exchange allows for us to mutually agree to transfer property rights, ultimately leading to even greater value creation. How did we get to the term economics? The first term that looks like economics comes from combining the Greek word oikos, meaning house, and nemenon, meaning management, to get, you guessed it, household management. In fact, while most people today only know of Socrates' student Plato, another student, Xenophon, wrote an entire book on the art of household management, which included discussions of wealth and managing the household's finances. This word was brought into the Latin and eventually into English, with economy. Yes, that's spelled starting with a Y and ending with a Y. Economy is first referred to in English in 1440 in reference to managing a monastery. About a century and a half later, the term political economy would enter the English lexicon as thinkers began writing about a nation as having wealth and resources that needed to be managed by the state, similar to the household. Political economy would be the primary focus of the so-called mercantilists and classical economists, both groups ironically named by their opposition. Adam Smith wrote in opposition to the mercantile system and coined that term in 1776, and John Maynard Keynes wrote against the economists who preceded him and labeled them as the classical economists. Back to the discussion at hand. Adam Smith's definition of political economy was as a branch of the science of a statesman or legislator. He added that there were two goals: to provide for the people to produce the means of subsistence for themselves, and to ensure that the state has enough revenue to conduct public services. In the 19th century, economics began being used as a shorthand for political economy, but it was Alfred Marshall who was credited with the shift in terminology. In his 1890 book, Principles of Economics, he uses both the terms political economy and economics, but clearly favors the latter, because Marshall sought to transform the focus of the study from being both a science and an art useful to the politician, and rather to a science pure and applied. Political economy seemed too much like an art of the statesman, rather than a science of the best policy means to pursue a given political end. Since Marshall, economics has adopted rigorous mathematical methods for modeling and pursued a broader array of areas of study, so it's unsurprising that the term economics has stuck. Is economics unrealistic? And if so, does it matter? Every model of reality contains some simplifying principles. After all, if the model were just as complex as reality, it wouldn't be very useful. This is what Milton Friedman argued in his 1953 essay, Methodology of Positive Economics. Economics is not psychology. It's not seeking to recreate the extremely complex mental activity behind human decisions. Rather, it's seeking to model the outcomes that result. For this reason, Friedman suggested rather than focusing on the realism of assumptions, one should judge theory based on its predictive power. Do people literally engage in utility maximization when making decisions? Are they solving a system of equations and multivariable calculus problem? Of course not. But economists aren't confused into thinking that they do. The complicated math is just one way of modeling something very simple. People act in accordance with their preferences, but they face real constraints. What about firms and profit maximization? Does this really happen? Perhaps firms try to do this, but what would really ensure profit maximization takes place is the feedback loop of the market. If you have a consistent loss, meaning your revenue is less than your expenses, so you're actually destroying rather than creating value, you're not going to survive long in the market. Under competition, firms that do not maximize profit eventually shrink and even die. For this reason, firms can be said to act as if they optimize, even if they also aren't literally solving equations. Agents don't literally optimize, and that's why the market process is so important. Markets can provide the feedback loop to move us closer to optimality. Economist Richard Wagner writes that economics is built on mythological presuppositions, in the sense that, quote, myths are fictions that nonetheless encapsulate mixtures of belief and knowledge that render the world of experience sensible and apprehensible to those who embrace those myths. Sometimes the myths justify which model to use in a given scenario. Other times, it's analogies that anthropomorphize the spontaneous order. While useful heuristics for modeling, it's critical that students of economics not pretend or misinterpret these myths as capturing the fullness of the underlying reality. It's hard to get very far in economics before hearing about Homo economicus. Who is he and what's his deal? Homo economicus is the hypothetical representative individual abstracted by economics. In fact, the term is simply Latin for economic man. Generally, when you open an economics textbook today, you'll see a discussion of a rational agent, which is simply the modern adaptation. Homo economicus is meant to represent the key assumptions of economic agents. The fundamental defining quality of Homo economicus is that he is self-interested. Now, what does that mean? Notice I didn't say selfish. Rather, self-interested is a catch-all term we use to say two things. Individuals have preferences among potential actions and outcomes, and act in accordance with those preferences. Now, these preferences can be selfish, or they can be altruistic, or a mix of the two. Violating certain moral or cultural precepts might be so painful to individuals, whether personally, socially, or spiritually, that these options are ruled out. Likewise for Homo economicus. The key point is that Homo economicus makes the most of his resources to predict the best way to accomplish his goals and satisfy his desires. Now, in the simplest models, Homo economicus can have perfect knowledge of different options available to him. But this need not be the case. Economists recognize that individuals' knowledge is limited. People learn through doing, and through trial and error. A significant quantity of microeconomic research is focused on decision-making under uncertainty. So what makes the economic agent different from actual people? We note that Homo economicus has desires, goals, and preferences. But by and large, we're not focused on why or how these preferences came to be. And in our role as economists, we're not judging these preferences. What's abstracted is the fact that regardless of the origin or content of these preferences, the economic agent makes decisions based on costs and benefits. Not everyone is a fan of the standard methodology of microeconomic theory. Nobel laureate and economist James Buchanan was critical of the standard approach to price theory and welfare economics. In his 1969 book, Cost and Choice, he argued that we should not confuse two different types of academic theorizing, the pure logic of choice and predictive theories of behavior. For Buchanan, the pure logic of choice is primarily designed to explain why choices are made, and it's rooted in individuals' subjective valuations of both costs and benefits. Because of this, it's ultimately unobservable. When objective price ratios appear to differ from a cost of production, we can hypothesize that there are non-pecuniary or non-economic unseen factors playing a role. For instance, the difficulty of work or the uncertainty of outcomes, various unmeasurable costs that explain a persistent divergence. But this explanation is tautological. The whole thing's true by the way we've defined the terms. When we start from the assumption that individuals make choices such that they perceive the benefits are greater than the costs, we approach each action with that assumption in mind. Predictive theory, however, must look to something more tangible and observable. It can suggest that individuals act as if they respond to objective variables like prices and quantities. Buchanan writes, quote, "Only prices have objective empirical content. Neither the marginal evaluations of demanders nor the marginal cost of suppliers, that is, the marginal evaluation of foregone alternatives, can be employed as a basis for determining prices. Prices are not brought into equality with some objectively determinable and empirically measurable phenomena on either the demand or the supply side of the market. Thus, we cannot take objective measurements of quantities of goods and determine what prices should be in some objective sense, because there's not an objective way to measure costs. But Buchanan argues that what economists can do is predict how changes in the environment will shift the actions of given actors." Does biology have lessons for economics? UCLA economist Armin Alchian thought so. In his 1950 paper, Uncertainty, Evolution, and Economic Theory, Alchian suggests that economists should look at natural selection to understand the operation of the market. Instead of using economics to predict how particular individuals and firms will act, we should use it to predict the more viable types of economic interrelationships. Alchian notes that much of microeconomic theory is built upon optimization, utility, and profit maximization. But when individual agents face uncertainty, optimization is no longer possible. After all, consider two potential projects that a firm could undertake. Even with a known probability distribution of potential profits and losses, if one project has a lower mean profit but a narrower spread, while the other has a higher mean profit but a wider spread, Alchian writes that maximization is not a criterion you can use. We can only know the maximum in hindsight. Instead, we should focus on how natural selection operates within the economic system. What's the method by which successful and surviving firms are selected by the system? Under the free market system, it's the realization of profits. If firms are not all identical but choose varying strategies, we will then end up with the lower cost firms surviving and the higher cost firms not. Likewise, we can predict the characteristics of the new set of firms that arises, whether it's literally a new group of firms or simply a new group of the old firms that survive. This means that much of microtheory doesn't even need to rely on individual foresight, or even firms being aware of the demand curves they face, or their own cost curves. These mathematical equations, he writes, are for the use of the economist, and not necessarily the businessman or the firm. Selection within the market will weed out high-cost firms, and through trial and error, businesses discover what works and imitate those that are successful. It's because of this process, Alchian writes, quote, "The economist can predict the consequences of higher wage rates, taxes, government policy, etc. Like the biologist, the economist predicts the effects of environmental changes on the surviving class of living organisms."